Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teniola Shoboale. We begin today in Ethiopia, where fighters of the Tigray People's Liberation Front have been seen trying to regroup outside the city of Mekelle just days after losing the state capital. That's according to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who days earlier declared the conflict over. But the head of the TPLF said his forces would fight on, indicating the conflict might not be completely over. Hundreds of people are believed to have been killed from both sides since fighting began 4 weeks ago. Meanwhile, TPLF politicians in Ethiopia's Tigray region say they have released over 4,000 soldiers who had been held captive. Officials say they had been part of the army's northern command but were detained when Tigrayan troops attacked a federal military base. Before the war started, the military had troops in the north of Ethiopia who were from different regions of the country, but when Tigrayan fighters suddenly attacked the main base, triggering the war, thousands of non-Tigrayans suddenly found themselves in what was enemy territory. At least 3,000 soldiers were detained by the TPLF, but have now been freed. Well, let's get more on this story from African Affairs analyst Achike Chude. Thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
On one hand, TPLF fighters are regrouping. On the other hand, they are releasing thousands of captured federal government soldiers. What signal exactly are Tigrayans sending with these maneuvers?
I think what they are trying to do by that is to give the impression that they have not reached a point of no return. This is obviously if they consider they capture the military soldiers as enemies who are capable of being reintegrated back into the army and used against them, then there's no way they would have released them. So I think it's a positive kind of signal that they're sending to the Ethiopian government that there is still a place for dialogue. Otherwise, it will be risky to release people who might eventually be used again against them. So it's in a way, even though the hostility is still ongoing, but in a way, it's a kind of olive branch that they are giving out to the Ethiopian government that they are open for dialogue, they are open for negotiation. And I think that it is now left for the Ethiopian government to respond, either positively or negatively. And I think that response from the Ethiopian government will determine how this situation will unfold.
Well, aid agencies are warning of grave humanitarian situation in Tigray, but the Prime Minister says no civilians have been killed by his troops since the conflict began. How would you explain, the conflicting reports here?
Well, governments have a way of holding back on information, even in normal times. Then in a serious situation like this, such as a war situation, propaganda is often used as a veritable instrument of war. And so you talk about all kinds of either misinformation or disinformation, false information being given to achieve certain objectives or certain ends. And so it is not expected, even in advanced democracies. There's always that tendency for governments to want to hoard information and release only those information they feel will have a certain impact within the country. So lies and holding back on information are really not far from what governments do in such a situation. Of course, there's no doubt that, again, at such moments, it is always better, more positive, it's always much better, to listen to, especially international media organizations, independent observer groups. You tend to get much more reliable information, credible information from them. And so, I mean, the Prime Minister says that there are no civilian casualties. That is a very strange one. If wars are being fought completely outside of a civilian settlements, then you can also say that perhaps that might be true. But usually, it has been proven from time and time again that civilians, innocent people, usually bear the brunt of a major war, confrontations when two armies fight. And so it is a very strange one that he says that there has not been a civilian casualty. But like I said, such information coming out from the government or even from the other side, when they give such information, should be taken with a pinch of salt.
Interestingly, Prime Minister Abiy received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, yet he has so far refused to dialogue with the Tigray leaders or foreign mediators. Do you think perhaps that the Nobel Prize was a bit premature?
Well, I don't know exactly, but I remember I was in your studio some time ago and we were discussing Prime Minister Abiy. And I think I lauded some of the things he had done because at that particular point in time, he had shown himself to be a veritable peacemaker in the African continent. And he was doing a lot of things. He was involved in the crisis in Sudan, between Sudan and then the South Sudan government, where we had even the internal crisis within South Sudan. And then other parts of the African continent, he always showed himself as a peacemaker. So by the time he was giving that award, there are not so many people that actually spoke against the award. They felt it was a very well-deserved award. So you would expect that, or given that circumstance, somebody that has shown himself as a peacemaker, that he would be the very first person to embrace some form of dialogue and negotiation with the rebels to look for a way out of it. And it is strange. But then again, we remember that the situation with Aung San Suu Kyi, of Burma, Myanmar, formerly called Burma. You don't forget that she was also a recipient of the Nobel Prize on the basis of her engagement over human rights issues. And then when the Rohingya issue started, and thousands of them were killed, many of them, displaced, she was nowhere to be found in terms of those virtues that she had proclaimed in the past, for which she got the Nobel Prize. So I think that, Prime Minister Abiy is doing himself a lot of disservice and then proving in a way unworthy of the Nobel Prize that he has gotten. Unless he changes his path, it is not, his attitude right now is not in consonance with the spirit, and the noble objectives of the Nobel Prize that he was given.
Well, Sudan is already bearing the brunt of the conflict, as it is now playing host to over 40,000 refugees. How should the international community react to this conflict that just might not be over?
Yeah, well, I think it has to be handled on two fronts. One is to ensure that hostilities cease. So they must put in some more vigorous diplomacy, especially with the government of Sudan. And like I said earlier, answering your previous question, that the fact that the Tigray forces were able to release thousands of Ethiopian troops shows that they are willing perhaps to enter dialogue with the Ethiopian government to begin to settle some of their grievances. And so it is not a lost cause from that perspective. So they must tackle the matter at the root, go to Ethiopia and see what they can do between the government and the rebel forces. Then beyond that, again, of course, is the issue of the refugees we just talked about. Sudan can ill afford it. Of course, Sudan has been embroiled in the political crisis for quite some time, and it's not as if they're completely out of it. They have all kinds of deep-seated economic problems. And so, of course, the international community is expected to help. But then how much more can you depend on the international community each time a crisis breaks out across the continent? Then, of course, a lot of them are suffering from donor fatigue. What with the COVID-19 situation, crisis that has, really depressed the economies of even the Father Christmas nations, if I use that expression. So there is a greater reluctance today for them to contribute to, causes such as the issue of the influx of refugees. So they must make sure that these refugees can be brought back to the Sudan, to Ethiopia. And the only way they can do that is to ensure that they bring both sides, warring sides, to the negotiating table, and ensure that there's a cessation of hostilities and look for political settlement, so that these refugees can be brought back. There is not much resources in the international arena for to continue to look after new refugees as a result of the new outbreaks of violence in the continent.
All right, then, African Affairs analyst Achike Chude, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and analysis with us on Network Africa.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Kenny.
Moving on now, Amnesty International's urged the UN Security Council to maintain its arms embargo on South Sudan amid extreme violence by government forces and an increase in attacks on civilians, including war crimes. Amnesty says it has documented a series of extrajudicial executions, forced displacement, torture, and destruction of civilian property by government and former opposition forces. The human rights organization cited a fourfold increase in violence in the states of Jonglei, Lakes, Warab, and Western Equatoria between April and June this year, compared to the same period last year. The UN Security Council is due to conduct a midterm review of its arms embargo and other measures on South Sudan before December the 15th. While making their third group visit to Somalia's federal member states, representatives from some of the country's main partners have emphasized the need for Somali leaders to remain in dialogue with one another, as well as continue in the spirit of consensus, which has recently seen progress on preparation for national elections. The visit to Puntland was the third group visit to an FMS by AU, EU, IGAD, and UN representatives in the past 2 months. This follows visits to southwest states and Galmudug, with visits to the remaining FMSs, Jubaland and Hirshabelle, planned in the next future.
We continue to urge all of Somalia's leaders to remain steadfast in their commitment to collaborating with each other as the electoral preparations progress. At the same time, we believe that the resumption of such dialogue on a regular basis can help resolve outstanding issues. The dialogue and spirit of consensus which yielded these agreements needs to continue in order to ensure that the national elections remain on track and are anchored in transparency, fairness, and inclusivity. We wish to emphasize that the agreed electoral model should not be reopened, but has to be implemented in an acceptable, credible, and transparent manner. In particular, we stress that this will include ensuring that the 30% quota for women in the parliamentary elections and in the implementing bodies is achieved.
In Uganda, several people have been injured as security forces dispersed supporters of presidential candidate Robert Kyagulanyi, known as Bobi Wine, in Kayunga near Kampala. Reports say 4 members of his campaign team were injured. One of them, identified as Bobi Wine's music producer, Dan Magic, was hit in the face. A police officer who is part of the security detail given to presidential candidates by the Electoral Commission also suffered head injuries. Almost 2 weeks ago, 54 people died in protest as the candidate supporters called for his release from detention. He had been arrested at a campaign rally. Bobi Wine was later charged with violating pandemic restrictions on gathering of crowds and later granted bail. Human Rights Watch has accused Tanzanian authorities of gravely abusing at least 18 Burundian refugees and asylum seekers since late last year. In a new report, the rights watchdog says Tanzanian police and intelligence services forcibly disappeared, tortured, and detained at least 11 Burundians for up to several weeks in abysmal conditions in a police station in Kigoma region. The report claims that Tanzanian authorities forcibly returned 8 of them to Burundi, where they have been detained without charge, while 3 were released in Tanzania. Also, HRW says 7 other refugees and asylum seekers have been arrested and forcibly disappeared since January this year. More than 150,000 people live in Tanzanian camps, many of whom fled violence in Burundi after then-President Pierre Nkurunziza's decision to run for a disputed third term in 2015. South Africa has joined the world to mark World AIDS Day with special attention to youth, women and children who suffer violations in the country. Deputy President David Mabuza, who is the chairman of the South African National AIDS Council, challenged young HIV-positive people with whom he interacted with in Soweto to break the stigma surrounding the disease. Our South Africa Bureau Chief, Betty Dibia, reports.
Ahead of the main National AIDS Day event, also in Soweto, South Africa's Deputy President David Mabuza had an interactive session with a group of young men and women living with HIV. Some shared how they became HIV positive and the sometimes difficult journeys so far.
Thank you very much for exposing all these things that are a problem to yourself. You have made us wise as government. We are here today because of the many challenges that are facing our people. And we've developed a number of strategies, a number of ways to respond to these challenges. But the journey, like I said, is still long.
32 years since the first World AIDS Day was marked, South Africa still has nearly 8 million people living with the virus, about a fifth of the global HIV population. The nation, however, has the world's largest ARV treatment program, and people have pushed back the setbacks of the Thabo Mbeki denialist years and are living longer. However, according to the UNAIDS, in 2018, 240,000 new infections were recorded in South Africa, while 71,000 people died of AIDS-related illnesses. Now there's COVID-19, and some of the HIV/AIDS activists have been worried about a loss of attention to HIV.
My challenge is that we've made a really blunder when how as a country we responded to COVID-19. Our response was more based on COVID, not integrating COVID and HIV.
In actual fact, we have reached a stage where we have to reflect very seriously, because otherwise all the gains that we have made, we have lost ground or the gains on the number of people that we put on treatment. We have particularly lost the ground on the number of people who are having their viral load tests done, so that we see that they are virally suppressed.
South Africa is said to be making good progress towards the UNAIDS 90-90-90 targets with regard to testing and viral suppression. But Deputy President Mabuza, who chairs the National AIDS Council, also admits that the road ahead is still a long one. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Betty Dibia, Channels Television News.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization says that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound effect on people living with HIV, as it has disrupted the programs fighting HIV and put carriers of the virus at a greater risk. The health body warns that people with HIV have a higher risk of contracting another disease because of their compromised immune systems.
There is some evidence that people living with HIV may have an increased risk of severe disease and death from COVID-19. This increased risk has been compounded by disruptions to treatment for people living with HIV. In a WHO survey of 127 countries earlier this year, more than a quarter reported partial disruption to antiretroviral treatment for people with HIV. However, with support from WHO and the work of health and community workers, the number of countries reporting disruptions in HIV services has declined by almost 75%.
What we've seen in at least HIV services is that early on we saw some dipping in terms of the number of people getting tested, the number of people getting put onto treatment, and that can have effects over the long term of increased deaths, increased new infections. But we've seen since June up until November sort of a rebound where as the cases are lower, systems have been able to regroup and put more people back onto therapy, shore up their ARV stocks, make sure that they have adequate supplies, ensure that the healthcare workers are doing multiple tests, not only taking care of COVID testing, combining COVID and HIV testing with TB testing, so that essentially really that the healthcare workers can start to rebuild and build back better.
Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta says the country is now looking to the east for a potential COVID-19 vaccine. The president gave the Ministry of Health the go-ahead to shop for vaccines from China. This decision comes in the wake of rich countries in the West buying nearly 3.8 billion doses of vaccines currently in development. China's President Xi Jinping in May promised that successful vaccines being tested will be offered to Africa at a discounted price. Experts have argued that this offers a potential route to cool off the resentment and criticism that China received on how it handled the pandemic earlier on. Algerian President Abdelmadjid Tebboune has left a German hospital and will be returning home soon. That's according to a statement from the presidency. Mr. Tebboune was flown to Germany for treatment in a hospital on October the 28th after he tested positive for coronavirus. Since then, very little information has been revealed to the public about his condition, which fueled speculation and concern among Algerians on social media about what they called their missing president. The last communication from his office was in mid-November, when it said the president had completed the COVID-19 treatment protocol without indicating the date of his return home. Botswana says it's sending thousands of wild elephants back to neighboring Angola. The southern African country has the largest number of elephants in the world, an estimated 130,000 of them. But tens of thousands are actually refugees from Angola's civil war between 1975 and 2002. They are now speculated to repopulate and recolonize their former habitat in southeast Angola. Botswana opposition MP and conservationist Boberogo Nkwana says that elephants have a big home range that includes Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, and Angola. And that's the program today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Teniola Shuboale.